America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we certainly have quite a program for you today. Just a few minutes, we're going to be talking with our good friend, of course, Penna Dexter, who will also be, of course, with us tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. Then we'll be talking with Professor Robert George about his new book, and I think you will appreciate that conversation. And next hour, we have Lee Strobel on about his new book, Seeing the Supernatural. And if that's not enough, if you have not heard, let me be the first to announce that we have a new pope. And I think in some respects that'll be a good conversation to have with Robert George, who is Catholic in his background. But the conclave has indeed selected a pope, and it is Robert Prevost, who is the new leader of the Catholic Church. It is an individual, interestingly enough, who is a Chicago native, so you can, I think in many ways, refer to him as the first American pope, although he is also a Peruvian citizen. I think some people don't know that. Spent time in Peru as a missionary, and then later as the archbishop, was brought here by Pope Francis, and so is well known for many people inside the Catholic Church, maybe not as much outside. But again, as you know, white smoke appeared from the Sistine Chapel at about 6 p.m. in Italy time, and that was signaling that the Pope had been chosen. Then, of course, all the details put together. The first American Pope has now taken the name Leo XIV. He has now greeted the crowd outside, greeted the Catholic faithful there, waiting to hear from him for the first time. And this one was, again, a fairly short conclave. The one that actually began on Wednesday, we talked about yesterday, and was held, as we mentioned yesterday, in Vatican's Sistine Chapel. If you want to try to put this in some perspective, before that we had Pope Benedict, who resigned in 2013, which led to a papal conclave, which then selected Pope Francis, who died at the age of 88 on April 21st. So we do have a new pope. I think we know a little bit more about him. As I said, an individual that is a native of California, but also a citizen of Peru. And we'll certainly get into all the details about that as more unfolds. And I think in some respects, the conversation we'll have in about a half an hour with Professor Robert George will be enlightening as well, since as a Catholic, he's very familiar with some of the individuals and can give us some perspective. Just before we get Penna Dexter on at the quarter hour, let me just mention we have posted a couple of articles for you to read today. Won't have as much time to cover them because we'll be talking with a number of different guests. But first of all, one of those, which comes from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, which is coming back to this particular report that comes from the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a 409-page study. It was commissioned by President Trump to look at this issue of what you might call gender medicine or gender dysphoria. The other day we posted one that was maybe a little more critical. This one is very supportive of the report, and we have another article that we will talk about tomorrow when we have Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews. But again, the argument that is being made here is that this is, in some respects, the study a rebuke, they say, of the political and medical conformity that is developed around this idea of gender identity, including some of these very radical treatments, which are even many times opposed by the parents. The evidence, they say, has deep uncertainty about its purported benefits. They say that things like puberty blockers, cross-sex hormone treatments, surgeries, and the rest really carry some very significant risks. and are not outweighed by the supposed benefits. As you might know, medical groups and especially LGBTQ groups have been very critical of it. But here, the report and the editors of the Wall Street Journal say that medical associations have created a perception that there is a professional consensus. But that consensus, as the Wall Street Journal reminds us, is driven by groups like the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And in some respects, if you say, well, why should I trust something from the Department of Health and Human Services? After all, Donald Trump is in office. We just know that he probably would have a bias, although I think probably less than maybe some might have, or that even the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., would have a bias. They go on to remind you that this study that came out from the Department of Health and Human Services is consistent with what we've seen in Europe. For example, you have the United Kingdom had what's called the Cass Review that came out last year, 2024, found very little evidence that puberty blockers and the like improve the mental well-being of children. And of course, they're all the negatives, which are described here in this article. And then you have other European countries, oftentimes ones that are seen as the most progressive. I'm thinking about Sweden and Finland, who've also backed away from these medical interventions. So this article, I think, would be very helpful if you are hearing in the news people that are slamming the report from the Department of Health and Human Services. I think it provides a very important antidote, and we will spend some time tomorrow, probably at least a segment or two, talking about it with our two guests that will be around the roundtable, Penna Dexter and Merrill Matthews. Let me just real quickly, at least for our listeners in the state of Illinois, say that this piece by Richard Porter called Hyperbole, Lies, and Delusions is all about the speech that the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, gave in New Hampshire. Why did he give that there? I think he's running for the presidency, which is fine. But nevertheless, they go into, and this article goes into, when you make such outrageous statements, are you really just deluded, or are you knowingly lying, or are you engaging in hyperbole? And so they say, is he channeling Seinfeld, Smollett, or something else? The Seinfeld reference is, if you've ever watched Seinfeld, you know that they have what was called the soup Nazi. Now, that was just hyperbole because Seinfeld and the audiences knew that this person that was very gruff, handing out soup, was not a member of the SS. So we can put that into hyperbole. We recognize some people are deliberately lying. That's why they used the idea of Jesse Smollett, who made the claim that some so-called MAGA brothers actually wanted to strangle him, and he just escaped with his life, and that was a calculated, elaborate, and harmful hoax. But then sometimes people actually believe this, and they use the example here of the Salem witch trials, which were a terrible consequence of mass delusion. So the question was, in light of all the incredible things Governor Pritzker was saying up there in New Hampshire, is he channeling Seinfeld, Smollett, or Cotton Mather? And of course, since we're coming up to a break, we don't have a chance to read all of those, but this goes on for 3 pages, and you have to say, I hope he doesn't believe some of this, because it's just outright wrong, and it's a lie, and it's maybe a lot of hyperbole, and it's made to get people all excited, but it is not even close to reality. And we're going to be talking about that today with Robert George, who's had a back and forth with Cornel West. So we've got a lot to cover today. When we come back, we're going to spend some time with our friend, Penna Dexter, co-host and good friend, and she'll be on with us right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Former member of Congress Mike Gallagher argues that it is time for accountability on the COVID lab leak cover-up. He reminds us that after millions have died and a world suffered billions in economic value lost, the West can claim 0 lessons learned. He also says that Anthony Fauci should have come clean about the pandemic's laboratory origin and admitted the Wuhan's lab's risky gain-of-function research was a mistake. Of course, none of that has happened. Instead, he reminds us of how the Chinese Communist Party was allowed to bleach the crime scene, while Dr. Fauci and others were able to whitewash history. They insisted for years that the origin of the virus was natural. Dr. Fauci continued to make this claim in a paper published last November. Mike Gallagher proposes several action steps. First, he proposes that President Trump should declassify all intelligence of COVID's origin. Congress did vote to require President Biden to declassify relevant intelligence, but all he did was publish a semi-redacted 10-page report. Second, President Trump should empower agency heads to drive a push for accountability. CIA Director John Ratcliffe has begun this, but a full investigation must take place. Attorney General Pam Bondi should issue subpoenas for relevant communications. Finally, President Trump should establish a multi-nation tribunal akin to the International Criminal Court, but with actual teeth, to investigate the origin of the virus, examining evidence of negligence or intentional misconduct, and determining the culpability of key people and institutions. So many questions remain for a pandemic that changed our world in many ways. We deserve answers and a full investigation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of intelligent design, go to viewpoints.info/intelligent design. Viewpoints.info/intelligent design. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to spend some time at the bottom of the hour with Professor Robert George about his book, Truth Matters. And the next hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend Lee Strobel, Seeing the Supernatural. I think you'll appreciate both those conversations. And we'll probably open up the phones then to give you a chance to ask some questions or make some comments. But as you know, if you've been listening this week, we have used this week to talk a little bit about the encouraging you and encouragement to you to actually take the time to subscribe to the Viewpoints commentary. Mine comes into your inbox Monday through Friday. Penna Dexter's, a weekly commentary, comes to you on Saturday. I thought we'd just get Penna on briefly by phone. Of course, she'll be in studio tomorrow to talk about that as well. And Penna, I thought maybe I'd just start off by saying, why should people subscribe to your and my commentary?
Well, Kerby, thanks for having me on, and you've got some great guests today. So I hope people listen to this entire program. But yes, I think that the viewpoints are important because we have, of course, the opportunity on Point of View to have a 2-hour long-form program every weekday. But sometimes it's also good to take topics that are either maybe something we don't talk about on Point of View, or something you could make a really good, concise point about that's in the news, and put them in people's minds and give them something just to, so they can remember 1 or 2 points out of that day, or pass it on to a friend, which we encourage people to do.
One of the things I might just mention is that you can get a little bit of an understanding of what is coming up. Mine today is on the COVID cover-up. Yours, which we will post tomorrow, so people can even read it before they get it in their inbox on Saturday, Unhappy Liberal Women. But I guess maybe I should ask you the question I get all the time. I'll answer it too. Where do you get these ideas? Because I've had many people say, I appreciate reading your commentary, but where do these ideas come from? You have to write one every day, or in your case, you have to write one once a week. Where do those ideas come from?
I'm amazed that you write one every day, Kerby, but it's because we read a lot. We read a lot, and we read broadly, and so a lot of things, I think, just this, I'm certain it's true for you also, it's true for me, that they just come into my mind, and I either think, people that listen to Point of View don't know this. Let me put this into a commentary. Or we talk about this all the time on Point of View, but I want to give this aspect of it or explain this part of it. And sometimes it's just something that I think everybody would get a kick out of or be very interested in. I like to make fun of things sometimes. And so, like, for instance, talking about women being more liberal, or liberal women being unhappier than men, that's really sad, but there are a couple of really good reasons for it. And so I wanted to put that into a commentary to help people understand, because some people would say, well, you're just being mean by saying that. No, there are reasons for it.
Well, and that's another thing I thought that was really important about these commentaries. Today, we just briefly talked about the Department of Health and Human Services report. We actually had one earlier in the week in which I talked about how the certain medical associations and the LGBTQ organizations have condemned it as transphobic. And then we are going to, you and I and Dr. Merrill Matthews are going to be talking about one from the Free Press about this as well. And so that sometimes, Penna, are issues in the news and you say, okay, I just saw that covered by NBC, CBS, NBC, CNN, whatever it might be, and I don't really know how to respond to that. And so sometimes one of the reasons we do this is we recognize when you're listening to us, the words are coming fast and furious, but if you and I are forced to try to summarize that in about 300 words, we give you the facts, the figures, and some of the references.
Yes, when I started doing commentaries many, many years ago, because I was so used to doing Point of View, it was hard to get it into 2 minutes. But I was asked to do that, and for another network, actually. And, I started realizing that it was a very good discipline to be able to do that and a service to listeners, because sometimes it's hard to remember everything that you've heard on a long-form show, even though it helps inform your understanding. But if you have these commentaries, and of course you can either listen again or print it out, read it, or pass it along to someone, and so you can just get it into your head better. And I think that's helpful for people, especially today when there's so many voices out there.
I thought we might also just give people a look at how you put it together. I know that most people will think, okay, well, Kerby comes in front of the microphone, and after you do 2 hours of Point of View, then you record that, and Megan then takes out any of the glitches and puts it back up there for everybody to see, and that goes on to what are called FTP sites, and it's on the Moody Broadcasting Network, American Family Radio, and Bot Radio Network, and a variety of others, and many of the stations that carry this program. But I think people would be interested to find out how you record your program.
Well, it's different than the way you do it, Kerby, because you're there every day, and you've got wonderful Megan helping to, I guess you can call it sweeten it. When you record something and it's not perfect, they can, some wonderful talented editor like her can get it to be very, very professional and perfect. And that's what she does, and that's what you do. For me, I am only very, very sporadic in my appearances on Point of View, so I'm not over at the studio like you are. So I do a lot of reading. I write it, usually on a Saturday, maybe a Friday afternoon. And then on Sunday, after I get back from church, I go into my closet where I've got lots of clothes and, soft things. I have a little microphone in there on a shelf, and I record it there. I have an editor also. Her name is Sarah. And she's been editing my commentaries for years. I send it, put it up for her, and she edits it and sends it out. And that's how we do it. So, there are many ways to do it with today's technology, and that's my way.
And I think it's so wonderful because I will listen to it, and it sounds like you had done it in one of these studios, and it's right there in your closet with a lot of clothes and things, and it just illustrated again that how we get that out there. But just before I let you go, let's talk about why, again, we might want to encourage people to subscribe. It is free of charge. Mine comes to your inbox free of charge Monday through Friday. Yours comes on Saturday, and I've encouraged people not only to sign up for it, and we have a a banner there that says subscribe today. But maybe even if they are listening to this and have not heard it in their own station or know of other radio stations that would benefit, there is a great way for individuals in other stations, program managers and general managers and others, to take it and to broadcast it as well. But one last time, why would you encourage people to sign up?
Well, I think you just made a really good point, because lots of times stations have these little breaks that are just 2 minutes long. And so it's a wonderful thing to just a very, very information-packed and wisdom-packed piece to just put right in there and use. So it's a great service to those stations' listeners. I do encourage people to talk to their station managers and try to take that. A lot of them could really use it. They would probably love it if they knew about it. And, I guess I would encourage listeners also just to make it an important part of their day, because it just helps you have knowledge and wisdom for your own daily conversations. That's what I hear from friends who listen to it more often than anything else. It just gives them something to talk about, something to share with their friends. And I think those people that listen to Point of View, the daily broadcast, are already interested in those things and usually want to share them with others. So this is a great way to do it.
Well, again, Penna, looking forward to our program tomorrow. I don't know how we're going to get all of it in, but we'll do our best.
I don't either.
Of course, we do have a new pope, so we'll maybe mention that, but we're certainly going to get into many of the other issues in the news as well. So look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
I look forward to it too, Kirby. Thanks for having me today.
Let's, if we can, just before we take a break, encourage you to go to the website there. It says subscribe today. We've given you that opportunity. And as we've mentioned before, it's fairly easy to read. It only takes us 2 minutes, a little less than 2 minutes to even verbalize it. So it'll take even less time to read it. And back to getting information, my wife and I walk twice a day, and we occasionally run into some individuals that say, I saw your commentary. I want to ask you a question about that. So obviously, it isn't something where you just read it and forget about it. There are some people that actually then are looking for me out there when we're for our walk and want to go into further discussion about some of those issues. So we've made it easy for you to do so. We recognize, as we've said before, that many of you already support Point of View. Maybe you already received the booklets, the Outlook, and everything, but you've never signed up for the Viewpoints commentary. Or some of you say, look, I can't support you financially, but this is free. It would be something I would appreciate getting in my inbox every day. So again, we've made it easy for you to do so. When we come back, though, we're going to talk about this issue of truth. We talk about the Truth Team, new book called Truth Matters, a dialogue on fruitful disagreement in an age of division. Fascinating book, certainly a fascinating guest, Professor Robert George. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Let's be honest. Getting a well-rounded and biblical understanding of current events takes time that many of us simply don't have. Well, here's the good news. You can get thoroughly researched biblical insight on a variety of topics in 2 minutes or less each day by subscribing to Kerby Anderson's Viewpoints commentary. These short, free emails offer Kerby's personal perspective on issues affecting us in America, and they are filled with educational resources. Listen to this testimonial from David, a longtime Viewpoints subscriber.
I've been reading Kerby's daily commentaries every weekday for years now. Never miss one because they're always incredibly well written and researched, to the point, and really are meaningful. I would recommend the commentaries to anybody.
Subscribe to Viewpoints for free by going to pointofview.net/signup. That's pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We now have the privilege of spending some time talking with Professor Robert George. As you may know, as we've talked about him many times before, he's a legal scholar, political philosopher, intellectual, serves as the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and also the director of the James Madison Program there at Princeton University. Also the founder of the Witherspoon Institute. He's been a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, as well as a distinguished professor at law at Pepperdine and even a frequently visiting professor at Harvard Law School. He has co-authored this book, Truth Matters, a dialogue on fruitful disagreement in an age of division. Robert George, Cornel West. We've also posted an article that came out years and years ago that sort of first talked about this, that appeared in the Boston Globe, and this was To Unite the Country, We Need Honesty and Courage. And Professor George, it is a delight to have you on the program.
Oh, thank you so much, Kerby. It's an honor to be on with you.
Let's, if we can, ask the obvious question. We've been talking about the fact we have a new Pope, Robert Prevost, and Pope Leo XIV. And as a Catholic scholar, I suspect you may know something about him and certainly have some thoughts about the fact that we have a new Pope now, as of the decision that was rendered by the various individuals, 133 that actually brought him into being. Can you give us any perspective?
Well, I have to say that I was absolutely dumbstruck by the fact that an American was elected Pope. I would have given you 500 to 1 odds against an American being elected Pope in my lifetime, and perhaps even the lifetime of my children. So that's a genuinely remarkable thing. He is not someone I know personally. I have not met him. He has a very strong personal background, academic record of service to the church. He, of course, served in a very key position in the pontificate that just ended with the death of Pope Francis as the leader of what's called the dicastery for bishops. So he had a very crucial role in choosing the men who would serve as bishops in the various dioceses and archdioceses around the world. My impression is that he's a person who's very solid when it comes to matters of Christian doctrine and traditional biblical belief. He doesn't seem to be someone who's easily pigeonholed by political labels, conservative, liberal, centrist. I certainly wouldn't know myself how to classify him. There are some very significant needs of the church today, and I hope that he'll be in a position to meet those needs. We do need greater clarity of teaching, especially when it comes to moral issues. There's a saying, it's become almost a cliche, a truism, that clarity is charity. Mm-hmm. But even if it's a cliche or a truism, it's true. Clarity is charity. People need clarity about fundamental questions of right and wrong from the Christian perspective, from the biblical perspective. The second thing is that the church's administrative structure is in a state of some very significant disrepair, including its finances. Yes. The scandals have never really been, the sex scandals that so damaged the church in the early 2000s, and the church has been trying but feebly to deal with ever since, has got to be dealt with in a stronger way. Investigations that should have been done weren't done, and they still need to be done, including investigations into what influence was used, where, on whose behalf to influence key appointments within the church. And then there are issues in the international world. The church's agreement with China, with communist China, has not worked out at all well for Chinese Catholics who have suffered so grievously under the communist dictatorial regime there. And I think that has to be rethought and reworked and redone. So these are great challenges facing the Pope. I'm very interested and struck by what he chose to name himself. Yes. He chose to name himself in a great tradition here. He named himself Leo. He'll be the 14th Leo. And it seems pretty clear that what he's signaling by that is that he wants to be in the tradition of Leo the 13th. The first truly modern pope. Leo the 13th was pope during the final third of the 19th century and right at the beginning of the 20th century. And he's the pope who had to deal with the Industrial Revolution and all of the dislocations and changes and problems that arose, urbanization and mass urban poverty, labor questions, the rise of Marxism, the emergence of industrial capitalism, ferocious nationalisms, which only a few decades later would manifest themselves in forms of fascism and even Nazism. He was a great reforming pope. He was the pope that inaugurated the church's great tradition of what's called social teaching. It's teaching on matters of political morality, economics, social justice, in the good sense, not in the corrupted sense of social justice that we have today. So he's sending us a signal. The former Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo the 14th, is sending us a signal that he's going to be in the tradition of Leo the 13th. And I myself see that as a good sign. I just hope that he will be able to deliver on the promise that's implicit in the name he chose.
Wow. I was just thinking that we originally had you scheduled a couple weeks ago and didn't work out, and we had you here today. We couldn't have done any better with that summary. So thank you so very much for providing that.
You're welcome.
Let me also, since that is such a lead-in to the book, Truth Matters, a dialogue on fruitful disagreement in an age of division. 7 chapters, a lot of them dealing with truth. And, of course, we have what's called the Truth Team here, and we talk about the importance of truth all the way to the end when you get into the controversial issues, abortion, race, and identity. But you might give us the background, too, because this was a series of conversations, very wide-ranging conversations on a number of sessions, which were recorded, and we get a chance to see the interaction between you and Cornel West, and that relationship that developed, to me, is fascinating. Can you give us a little bit of an insight to that?
Well, yes, I certainly would be happy to do that. Of course, Professor West, my dear friend, my dear brother, Cornel West, is somebody who does not see political and social issues the way I do. He's very much a man of the left. I'm on the conservative side. He, Kerby, is the honorary co-chairman of Democratic Socialists of America. And if you know anything about me, Kerby, you know that I am not honorary co-chairman of Democratic Socialists of America. And yet, despite our deep differences, we have now for 20 years, 2 decades, been teaching together. Wonderful courses, basically sort of great books courses, beginning with the great Greek and Roman thinkers, figures like Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Cicero, going all the way up into the Christian early Christian period, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, figures like that, and then on up into the Renaissance, Reformation, and the Renaissance. The 19th century, teaching figures like John Stuart Mill and John Henry Newman. 20th century, John Dewey, C.S. Lewis, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And these have been wonderful courses. And we have been able not only to explore our differences on various issues, philosophical issues, practical, moral, and political issues, but also model for our students how you go about conducting your interactions with each other on important questions when you do not agree. How can we make our disagreement fruitful rather than just contentious? And we've achieved that, and we taught together until Professor West left Princeton, where he was teaching and where I teach, to go first to Harvard. He's now at Union Theological Seminary. And then when we were no longer in the same place, so we couldn't teach together, we took our show on the road.
Yeah.
And we lectured together, gave presentations together all over the country. And now we produced this book. We have found in the course of our extensive dialogues, both the formal public ones and then the private ones, at our homes and in restaurants after our events and, in hotel lobbies and all sorts of other places, we have found that, despite disagreeing on some very important things, we also have some important points of agreement. We believe in truth. We believe that, just quote the title of our book, truth really matters.
Yes.
It's important to be in touch with reality. It's bad to have false understandings of things. We also believe in the importance of free speech and civil discourse, because those are necessary to get at the truth of things. And then, of course, we're also united as fellow Christians, believers that human beings are made in the image and likeness of a all-powerful and loving God. So there are these points of agreement. Our teaching styles are very similar. Both of us absolutely avoid anything that could be remotely described as indoctrination. We do not see our job as getting our students to think the way we think.
Let me take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into this in a little bit more detail. Yeah, one of those mandatory breaks, but I do want to talk about some of the areas of agreement, because also there's a good amount of disagreement. We'll continue our conversation with Professor Robert George right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we are talking with Robert George and talking about the book that he and Cornel West put together called Truth Matters. Next hour, we're going to have Lee Strobel talking about his new book, Seeing the Supernatural. But Professor George, I was just thinking how unusual what you're doing is, and it shouldn't be. I was thinking of, for example, we oftentimes have people with Alliance Defending Freedom, and a while back we talked about when Kristen Waggoner was invited to the Yale Law School to actually have a discussion with one of the individuals with the American Humanist Association. It was put together by the Yale Federalist Society. And the idea is, can we find common ground? Can we emphasize free speech? But apparently the students didn't get the memo, and in some respects we are seeing what you and Cornel West have done still pretty unusual, and yet I'm old enough to remember when that was much more typical on college campuses.
Yes, that's right, and we have to get back there, and what Brother Cornel and I are trying to do is set an example for our own students and for people really all over the country of how two people who have some deep disagreements about some profoundly important issues can nevertheless work together, having in common the goal of trying to get at the truth of things. And by getting at the truth of things, the method that we employ is trying to draw out the best arguments, the best that's to be thought and said, the best evidence on one side of an issue, and then compare it with the best that can be argued, thought, said, best evidence on the other side of the issue. What happened to Kristen Wagner and her interlocutors, including my friend Professor Kate Stith of Yale Law School, was disgraceful. It wasn't all the Yale law students, but it was a substantial number of Yale law students who behaved in an utterly disrespectful manner, revealing not only, in my opinion, a bad upbringing, what parents would raise young men and women who would behave in that way, but also revealing that they were not interested in trying to learn anything, that they did not approach their education in a truth-seeking spirit. They assumed they already knew it all, that Kristen Wagner was not only wrong, but evil, and that they had nothing to learn from Kristen. Now, if you know Kristen, you know all of us have a great deal to learn from Kristen. She's a very intelligent woman. She's a very fine human being. Had they simply listened to her, they still might have disagreed with her, but they would have learned something. But they weren't interested, Kerby, in learning something. Yes. And that's the problem. They were simply interested in preventing her from having her viewpoint expressed, from expressing her viewpoint on the Yale Law School campus. That is an anti-intellectual, anti-truth attitude. It's a form of ideological tribalism that is toxic to the pursuit of truth.
Let's begin to talk about truth, because you have chapters on what is truth and why seek it. But one of the chapters that I thought was very intriguing, from the age of feeling to the joy of thinking. You and I are about the same age, and I used to speak on college campuses, and I still do that occasionally, but I do a lot of radio now. But I remember in the 1980s, I started noticing kids were no longer saying, well, I think. They'd say, well, I feel, or maybe even I believe. And I noticed this switch, and by the time you got to the 1990s, and you had political correctness and things like that, it got to be harder and harder to speak on college campuses. And it does seem to me that chapter in the kind of the middle of your book really talks about something that needs to change, doesn't it? Well, I guess we've lost Robert George. Sorry about that. Again, let me just mention real quick. We'll see if we can get him back. The book is entitled Truth Matters, and I thought that was really one of the most intriguing chapters there, because he was talking about from the age of feeling, then goes on to talk about truth and faith, confronting truth in history. And of course, there's a follow-up chapter or two about discerning truth. And as you might imagine, there are areas where Robert George and Cornel West would disagree: abortion, race, even sexual and gender identity, and those kinds of things. I think we have Professor George back again.
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened there. It's good to be back, though.
But again, we were just talking about this whole idea of individuals talking about I feel rather than I think, and you really want to get people back to thinking and listening to the other side, don't you?
Yes, you certainly do. I'll tell you where that concept of the age of feeling came from. You know, historians are fond of breaking the various epochs up into the age of this and the age of that, and so they tell us, for example, that the medieval period was the age of faith. Mm-hmm. Now, that's an exaggeration, of course, in the sense that, it was not just faith that was the criterion of truth and goodness and justice and virtue and right in the medieval period. A high premium was put on reason by medieval thinkers. If you think of the great
Aquinas.
Figures of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, Aquinas would be one, Maimonides would be another, Averroes in the Muslim tradition would be another. But still, there's some truth in the idea that for the medievals, faith was a central criterion of truth and goodness and justice. And then the same historians will say, well, that was the age of faith, and then came the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment was an age of reason or an age of science. And again, although that's an exaggeration, there were plenty of Enlightenment figures who were also devout religious believers. It's still, there's truth there that there was special premium placed on reasoning your way to judgments, using scientific methods and so forth to get to the truth of things. Well, if the medieval period was the age of faith, and if the Enlightenment was the age of reason, in what age do we live? And I'm here afraid we have to say we live in an age of feeling, the age of feeling. Mm-hmm. It's not reason, and much less faith, that is treated by people as the criterion of truth or goodness or justice or right. Rather, it's feeling. How do I feel about it, or how does it make me feel? The problem with that, Kerby, is that feelings are purely subjective, and they can lead us astray every time. You know, we can rely on the Bible. Our reason, though fallen and fallible, nevertheless gives us some access to truth. But our feelings are very unreliable as indicators of what is real and what's not real. And if we rely on our feelings, we will definitely be very badly led astray. And in so many ways today, we have been led astray. A man will abandon his wife, or a wife will leave her husband because I don't feel the same about him as I used to feel. We've lost any sense of objective reality, and we're just focused on our subjective feelings and being dragged around by them.
Well, again, we've had Professor Robert George with us. Sorry for the glitch that we had there, but let me again recommend this book, about 180 pages, 7 chapters, Truth Matters. Just a fascinating dialogue between Cornel West, who, by the way, was a presidential candidate. Don't think Robert George will be a presidential candidate, so there's another difference, along with socialist and all sorts of other ideas, liberal, conservative. But I think you will find it fascinating, and it's a model for what we want to have more of in the public arena. So, Professor Robert George, I always have appreciated you. We've quoted you from time to time here on Point of View, and it's quite an honor for you to be on the program with us today.
It was my honor. Yeah, thank you very much, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time with our good friend Lee Strobel. I caught him recently at an event, and he said, hey, I've got a new book out, Seeing the Supernatural. It's a New York Times bestseller. I said, well, of course. And he said, I'd love to come on Point of View. I said, well, consider it done, and that is exactly what we're going to be doing next hour. But just before we take a break, let me mention that if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about that book, or I'd like to know more about Robert George, of course, you can't do any better by studying under him at Princeton University if you wanted to do so. And I think it was fortuitous that at the day in which we have him selected to be on the program is the day in which they have selected the new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, and I think that part was as good, if not better, than some of the material we talked about on the book. So I think all of that worked out very well. But one more time, just before we take a break, let me just mention we do have a banner there that says subscribe today for the Viewpoints commentary. And, of course, you receive mine Monday through Friday in your inbox. Penna's on Saturday. And if you would like to sign up, we've made it very easy by just clicking on that button, and we would encourage you to do so. That's kind of our action item for this week. When we come back, we're going to talk about investigating the supernatural. Going to be a fascinating conversation with our good friend Lee Strobel. All that coming up right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This is an interview I've been looking forward to, because it is, of course, an interview we're going to be doing with Lee Strobel. He, of course, is the author of so many books we've talked about over the years, but this new one is one that I think would be quite intriguing to you: Seeing the Supernatural, Investigating Angels, Demons, Mystical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters, and Other Mysteries of the Unseen World. In some respects, we've heard some of that in a few of his previous books, but this one, again, is going to be one I think you're going to really appreciate. If you're not familiar with him, I don't know how you could not be, author of The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith, The Case for the Creator, as Case for Heaven, for example, looking at the evidence of life after death, Is God Real, and many other books that I can certainly recommend to you. And Lee Strobel, of course, is the award-winning legal editor at the Chicago Tribune, who became a Christian. Of course, you perhaps have seen the film. And Lee Strobel, it is just always a delight to have you on the program.
Well, Kerby, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. I sure appreciate you and your ministry on the radio. It's an awesome service to the body of Christ.
Well, and appreciate the fact that even when we did a truth team, you actually sent in support. So not only do you appreciate it, not only do you appreciate what we do, but you even shown that as well. And I just, first of all, want people to understand that this book, it really kind of breaks down into two sections. First 6 chapters are the supernatural among us, which I really wanted to spend some time on, and some of the people you've interviewed or people we've had on this program. And then the second part, the supernatural that awaits us. And I thought, first of all, as an individual that has written so many books, sometimes you say, why another book? But as I understand from what you said near the end of the book, that your editors at Zondervan recommended that you write this book.
They actually came to me with the idea and said, hey, why don't you do an investigation of the supernatural? And it took about 2 seconds for me to say, oh, my goodness, that really resonates with me, because first of all, I know that 8 out of 10 Americans do believe that there's something beyond what we can see and touch and put in a test tube. So there's a common ground there, a bridge that we can build on, because a lot of people are fascinated by the paranormal, the supernatural, and yet they delve into all kinds of unbiblical things. And so my hope in this is that we can tap into their interest in the supernatural, deepen the faith of Christians, but then give them a resource that they can share with people to give them a biblical perspective of this.
Well, I'm going to certainly try to go through all 12 chapters we can, but the first one gets into the issue of the soul, and I thought it was kind of striking that you actually dedicated this book to J.P. Moreland, and I was just thinking, those of us at Probe Ministries first ran into him in 1975. That's like 50 years ago, when he was Campus Crusade director at the University of Vermont, but of course, we've had him on before to talk about the soul. You have an interview with Sharon Dirks, but I think that is, one of the great starting points, because some people simply say, well, there's really no brain. There's a brain, but there's no mind. There's a body, but there's really no soul. And yet the evidence is going the other direction, isn't it?
It really is. And, of course, she has a PhD in neurobiology from Cambridge University, so she knows what she's talking about. And, a lot of people, skeptics, atheists, and so forth, believe we're just our brain. We have no immaterial component to our reality. So there is no soul, there is no spirit, there is no consciousness. It's an illusion that's conjured up by the processes of our brain. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. And one of the ones she points out is if you imagine a scientist, say, name is Mary, let's say, and Mary understands everything about eyesight. She understands how the human eye works. She understands how the optic nerve carries impulses into the brain that are reconstructed into a visual appearance. She understands everything of how the chemistry works of human sight, and yet she's blind. And the question is, if she all of a sudden got her sight for the first time, was able to see, would she learn anything different about sight? And the answer is, of course she would. Which means that the physical facts alone cannot explain the first-person experience of consciousness. So in other words, no amount of knowledge about the physical working of the eye and the brain would get her any closer to the experience of what it's like to actually see. So consciousness simply cannot be synonymous with brain activity. We are more than our brain. We are a hyphenate creature. That is a body and a soul. And J.P. Moreland, of course, is written much about that, and he actually ended up mentoring my son, who got his first master's degree at Biola University at Talbot Seminary.
Wow.
Under J.P. Moreland. Yeah.
Well, again, we say that we don't deny that there's a brain. It's like there's a computer,
right.
But who's watching the computer? And we've
exactly.
had all sorts of brain studies where they'll touch a part of the brain and your hands will move. And you say, why'd you move your hand? You said, I didn't. You made me move it. In other words, I made the... And so and most people, even our atheist friends, act as if we're more than our brains because if all we are is biological meat and biological computers, they're assuming that we're making volitional choices and things of that nature.
Right.
So even when they try to deny the existence of a mind or a soul, they sort of fall back into it, don't they?
They really do. I mean, as most people who believe that we're only a physical brain will concede that therefore we have no free will. Well, really? We certainly act as though we do. We certainly live as though we do. We certainly build our culture around the fact that we have free will. So it doesn't pass the livability test. It doesn't pass the smell test. It just does not add up ultimately. And I think Sharon Dirks does a good job in that chapter of kind of explaining why we're more than just our brain.
You also have a chapter on miracles. It's written by Craig Keener. And by the way, he's one of many individuals, including J.P. Moreland and Juster Byerly, as well as a variety of other people like Sheila Walsh and Paul Copan and Kirk Cameron and others that have all endorsed the book. And again, that's maybe familiar territory because you've written an entire book on this subject of miracles, haven't you?
I have. And, as you mentioned earlier, my background's in journalism and law. So I tend to be a person who likes evidence. I like corroboration. I like facts. And so I was looking at cases of miracles that are not something you read about on the internet that have nothing to back them up. I'm looking at cases that are scientifically established, that are done by medical researchers, that are published, many of them, in peer-reviewed medical journals. Cases where we have multiple eyewitnesses who have no motive to deceive, where we have medical records, and so forth. So I'm looking for these documented cases. And one of the ones I talk about in my book involves a woman who was blind for over a dozen years with an incurable condition. She went to a school for the blind. She learned how to read Braille. She walked with a white cane, and she married a Baptist pastor. And then one night they're getting ready to go to bed, and she's in bed. He comes over and puts his hand on her shoulder, and begins to cry, and begins to pray. And he says, Lord, I know you can heal my wife. I know you can, and I pray that you will do it tonight. And with that, she opened her eyes to perfect eyesight, which has remained now for 47 years.
That's right.
So this is a case that's been documented by multiple medical researchers, published in a peer-reviewed medical journal as a case study. And, what do you do with that? As she said, I was blind when my husband prayed for me. I opened my eyes and I could see perfectly. That was a miracle. And I don't think you can deny it was a miracle unless you begin with the presupposition that miracles are impossible.
Yes.
That's the only way you can rule it out.
We're going to take a break, and we'll get into some of the other supernatural among us, part of the book, Seeing the Supernatural. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Former member of Congress Mike Gallagher argues that it is time for accountability on the COVID lab leak cover-up. He reminds us that after millions have died and a world suffered billions in economic value lost, the West can claim zero lessons learned. He also says that Anthony Fauci should have come clean about the pandemic's laboratory origin and admitted the Wuhan's lab's risky gain-of-function research was a mistake. Of course, none of that has happened. Instead, he reminds us of how the Chinese Communist Party was allowed to bleach the crime scene while Dr. Fauci and others were able to whitewash history. They insisted for years that the origin of the virus was natural. Dr. Fauci continued to make this claim in a paper published last November. Mike Gallagher proposes several action steps. First, he proposes that President Trump should declassify all intelligence of COVID's origin. Congress did vote to require President Biden to declassify relevant intelligence, but all he did was publish a semi-redacted 10-page report. Second, President Trump should empower agency heads to drive a push for accountability. CIA Director John Ratcliffe has begun this, but a full investigation must take place. Attorney General Pam Bondi should issue subpoenas for relevant communications. Finally, President Trump should establish a multi-nation tribunal akin to the International Criminal Court, but with actual teeth, to investigate the origin of the virus, examining evidence of negligence or intentional misconduct, and determining the culpability of key people and institutions. So many questions remain for a pandemic that changed our world in many ways. We deserve answers and a full investigation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of intelligent design, go to viewpoints.info/intelligent design. Viewpoints.info/intelligent design. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Lee Strobel as we talk about the book Seeing the Supernatural, Investigating Angels, Demons, Mystical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters, and Other Mysteries of the Unseen World. We've already talked about the existence of the soul and miracles, but Lee, we have a chapter on life-changing spiritual encounters where you do an interview with Doug Groteis, but you start off by telling a story I've heard you tell about a man by the name of Robert who was on a beach in Florida, and all of a sudden he says God spoke to him and said, "Robert, I've saved you more times than you'll ever know. Now I need you to come to me through my son Jesus." And it's just as real as it can be. Most people actually do know Robert because his name, at least as he was best known as a motorcycle individual, was Evel Knievel. And I think if I'm right, if I remember right, he even called you up and says, "Hi, this is Evel." And you said, "Does Satan have my phone number?"
Exactly. That's exactly true. And it's a great example of how God sometimes chooses to dramatically and supernaturally reach down and touch an individual. You know, here's this guy, you know, Evel Knievel, who lived a very immoral life. He was a gambler. He was a drunk. He had a woman in every city. He once beat up a business associate with a baseball bat and went to jail for it. I mean, this was a sinful individual. And he's standing on the beach and he said, "Lee, I didn't hear God's voice through my ears. I heard it in my heart. And it was clear as day." He said, "Robert, I've saved you more times you'll ever know. Now you need to come to me through my son, Jesus." And it rocked him, and he didn't know what to do. He called up the only guy he knew who was a Christian, Frank Gifford. Remember him, the former sportscaster, and said, "Frank, I had this experience. Who's Jesus? I don't even know." And Frank said, well, get that book, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. That'll explain it. So Evil got my book. He read it. He had a radical conversion. I mean, I don't know how else you explain this other than God dramatically and supernaturally touched his life. When he got up to tell his testimony when he was baptized, the pastor literally ripped up his sermon and said, y'all have heard the gospel right now from Evel Knievel. Anybody who wants to, and this is a church that had never had an altar call. He said, anybody who wants to come up right now, receive Christ, be baptized, come on up. 700 people came forward in 2 services. I mean, and he was just sold out to serve Jesus Christ. In fact, when he died about a year and a half later, at his request on his tombstone, it says, believe in Jesus Christ.
Wow.
Well, how do we explain? You know who else had an experience, supernatural experience like that is Blaise Pascal, the famous French philosopher, famous for Pascal's wager. But, he had an experience with God that was so personal. He never told anybody about it in his whole life. But when he died, they were taking off his coat, and they realized there was something sewn into the lining next to his heart. And they took it out, and it was a contemporary account of this encounter he had with God, a supernatural encounter where God touched his life in a supernatural way, and he wrote it out as it was happening, and he saved it next to his heart for the rest of his life. Sometimes God does stuff like that, and I don't know how you explain it other than this is a supernatural event.
Well, again, sometimes God also uses dreams and visions. The interview you did there was with Tom Doyle's been in studio with us. I've known him for many years, and especially these dreams and visions in the Islamic world, and that's why you wanted to have a chapter on that as well.
Exactly. I mean, it's been estimated that up to a third of all Muslims who've come to faith in the last couple of decades have had a supernatural dream of Jesus before they converted. And what's interesting to me as someone who tends to be a skeptic is there is corroboration to these dreams. In other words, well, first of all, a devout Muslim in a generally closed society or an oppressive society toward the Christian message has no incentive to have a dream about the Jesus of Christianity that might lead them into apostasy and maybe a death sentence. So they're not predisposed to have a dream like this. But what happens is they don't go to sleep and have the dream and then wake up as a Christian. The dreams point them towards something else. So, for instance, there was a woman named Noor, mother of 8, and she is in Cairo, and she has a dream in which she encounters Jesus, unlike any dream she's ever had. And Jesus is so mesmerizing, and she feels the love and the grace and the beauty of Jesus, and she's mesmerized by him. And she says, "Why do you appear to me? I'm just a poor mother of 8 children." And Jesus said, "My friend will tell you why tomorrow." And she said, "Who's your friend?" And he gestured toward a man who'd been walking with them that she hadn't noticed because she was so mesmerized by Jesus. He said, "My friend will tell you." The next day, she goes to the crowded marketplace in Cairo, and she sees that man from her dream. And she goes up to him and says, "You're the one." And he said, "What are you talking about?" "You're the one. Same glasses, same face, same clothes. You're the one." And he said, "Did you have a dream about Jesus last night?" And she said, "Yes." Turned out he was an underground church planter, and he didn't want to go to the crowded marketplace in Cairo on Friday afternoon because it's chaotic. But he went because he felt God had an assignment for him. So he encounters Noor, but here's the key. Here's the corroboration. He pulls her aside, opens the Bible, and shares the gospel. That is the external corroboration that this is more than just a subconscious mind product, of a dream conjured up by a bad pizza they ate the previous night. There is an external component to this. I'll give you another example. There's a guy we call Omar who hated Jewish people, grew up in a refugee camp. He was going to join Hamas. And he's on the road walking to a place to meet with the Hamas leaders to join that terrorist organization when all of a sudden he's confronted by a vision of Jesus. And Jesus points to him and says, "Omar, this is not the life I have for you. I want you to turn around. I want you to go home. This is not the life I have for you." Well, he's stunned by this. He never had this experience before. He turns around. He goes home. That afternoon, a Christian family moved into the apartment across the hall from him. And he went over and he said, "I just had this encounter with Jesus. What do you think it means?" They opened the Bible, they shared the gospel with him, and today Omar himself is an underground church planter in the Middle East. So that's the kind of external corroboration that tells me that these are actual supernatural events.
Yeah, and again, one of the things you are quoting from are some of the work by Tom Doyle, as well as his wife Joanne, Women Who Risk and Dreams and Visions, Is Jesus Awakening the Muslim World? And in some respects, they have been toiling there for many decades, but because of the international exposure that you have, you're certainly providing people with more information on that. And I just thought I'd mention real quickly before we go to the break that a couple of the other chapters deal with angels and demons. And it does seem to me that sometimes people are actually being entertained by angels unaware. Matter of fact, one of your visitors said he didn't have wings, he didn't have flowing white robe, but it's pretty obvious it was an angel. Can you speak to that?
That's exactly true. I mean, we are told in Hebrews to anticipate that there are times when we may very well have an encounter with an angelic being, entertain one in hospitality, unbeknownst to us as an angel. And we have cases. So I tell the case of a story that was reported by Billy Graham, where a Scottish missionary went to the South Pacific, and he and his wife were sharing the gospel in this on this small island, and they had lived in a little cottage. And the local tribes people got mad; they didn't like the gospel, and so they came to kill him and burn down their house. So he and his wife are praying in their house, Lord, protect us, save us from this mob that's forming outside. And yet, by dawn, that mob dissipated and went home. Well, about a year later, that missionary led the chief of that tribe to faith in Jesus Christ. And he's talking to him, and he said, do you remember that time that you led a mob to come to my house and kill us and burn our house down? Why didn't you do it? And the guy said, well, who were all those men you had there? And he said, what are you talking about? There were no men. There's just my wife and I. And he said, no. Your house was surrounded by these muscular men in white garments with drawn swords. Well, who were they? They were angels, and God had sent them to protect this missionary and his wife. And we see stories like that, accounts like that are hard to explain other than the fact that God does send angels at times to protect us. You remember when Jesus was being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, could I not call upon my Father right now? And he would send legions of angels to protect me. And Martin Luther, in his small catechism, has a prayer that says, Lord, send your holy angels to protect me from the evil one. So, we are not to pray to angels. We're not to worship angels. But I think it's perfectly fine to pray to God about angels and say, God, send your holy angels to protect my family and me and my ministry and so forth. And I've started to do that. I didn't used to do that. But after my eyes being opened by the research in this book, I thought it'd be a very prudent thing to do.
I think so. And again, we're going to take a break, and we'll come back and look at the second part of the book, but it's probably already encouraged you to want to get a copy, but we only have covered basically about 5 of the chapters, and there's much more, which we are going to get to after the break. One more time, just before we take a break, Seeing the Supernatural, Investigating Angels, Demons, Mystical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters, which we're going to get into in just a minute, and Other Mysteries of the Unseen World. All that coming up right after these important messages.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net, look at the tabs across the top, find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us Lee Strobel, again, the author of this newest book, Seeing the Supernatural. And the first section deals with the supernatural among us in terms of the soul and miracles, spiritual encounters, dreams and visions, angels, Satan, and demons. But now, if we can, maybe focus on the supernatural that awaits us, looking at deathbed visions, near-death experiences. A lot of these chapters written by people like Dr. Paul Copan or J. Warner Wallace, Ron Rhodes, other individuals we've interviewed on the program. But one of those is this idea of deathbed visions. I remember when I wrote a book years ago for Zondervan on death and dying in the 1970s, there were only just a scant number of books about people that on their deathbed had seen something supernatural. But you interview Stephen Miller. Steve Miller has actually pulled together a number of books and a number of accounts which show that if you're a hospice nurse, you probably have seen these examples more frequently, but we're just now starting to find out about them.
Yeah, that's really true. By the way, Kerby, before I respond to that, I just want to interject something, and that is I really appreciate the Viewpoints commentaries that you do. And I heard the announcer mention those and how people can sign up to get those. And I just think they're excellent and a great way not to just understand the facts about the faith, but how we apply them in our worldview, how we interpret events in our culture and so forth. And so I really would highly encourage your listeners, if they don't already, to, I think you go to pointofview.net and sign up. And I know they're both in written form and verbal form, and it'll help you put your faith into action in our contemporary culture. So I just want to say thanks. I know those are hard work to do, but you do a great job.
Well, thank you. What about these deathbed experiences that people have?
Yeah.
It seems like there are more than we really ever have people record, and you found out quite a bit, didn't you?
Yeah, there are tens of thousands of these that have been studied. In fact, one team of researchers went to a large hospice facility in New York State and said to the dying people there, if you have a vivid vision, unlike anything you've ever had before, would you please tell us? We'd like to know. Because a lot of people who are dying, they don't want to say anything. They think you're going to think I'm crazy or something. Well, guess what? 88% of them reported a pre-death vision. These are incredibly common. And so I think the fact that they're so frequent argues for their authenticity, because if they only happen once in a blue moon, then a skeptic could say, oh, well, billions of people have died over time, and every once in a while some weird thing's going to happen. Don't give it any thought. But because they are so common, that tells us there's something behind this. But secondly, we often have, again, I'm looking for corroboration, evidence that these are real. So, for instance, one team of researchers studied 3,000 of these cases. And their conclusion, I'm going to use their words, they said these experiences are definitely not hallucinations, fantasies, or memories caused by grief, nor are they projections of the subconscious mind or products of an overactive imagination. There's something going on here. And here's the corroboration. Many times people will see, just like Stephen, in the book of Acts, it talks about Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, who's about to be stoned to death, but he has this vision where he sees the heavens open up and he sees the Father and the Son together. Well, this is similar. People who are on their deathbed will have this a vision of what is to come. So there's a case of a woman named Doris. This is in England. She's dying, and she sees the heavens open up. She sees angelic beings. She sees her father, who had died several years earlier, kind of welcoming her. And then she sees someone else, and she says, wait a minute, what is Vida doing with my father? What is Vida doing there? That makes no sense. Why is Vida there? And then she died. Well, Vida was her sister. And her sister Vida had died a couple of weeks earlier, but nobody had told Doris because she was so ill, they didn't want the shock of it to kill her. So they kept this news from her, and yet, in her vision of the life to come, she saw her now deceased sister. That is incredibly common. So that's a kind of corroboration to tell us this is something more than just a product of overactive imaginations.
And again, you have, of course, examples of multiple witnesses. You have the one of children, because some people might say, well, this is what people would expect to see, but children don't have that expectation. Right. So you really cover all the bases in a way that is, I think, very significant. And that also leads to the other chapter, and that is these extraordinary near-death experiences. And, of course, when we've interviewed you before about NDEs, near-death experiences, we've talked a lot about John Burke, and, of course, he is an individual that you've interviewed. He also gives a very nice endorsement of your book.
Yeah. And of course, he's the expert who studied 1,500 near-death experiences. He's a Christian pastor. And his analysis is that when you look at not how people interpret what they experience, but what actually takes place in a near-death experience, it is consistent with Scripture. Now, the difference between a near-death experience and a deathbed vision is in a near-death experience, someone is clinically dead. Now, they may have no brain waves, no respiration, no heartbeat, but they're going to come back. They're going to be revived. But in the case of deathbed visions, these are people who are about to permanently die. So that's kind of the difference there. But again, I'm looking for corroboration. And so we look at the case of a woman who was dying in a hospital, and she says, I was conscious the whole time. She said, my spirit separated from my body, exactly as the Bible says, and I was floating near the ceiling watching the resuscitation efforts on my body. And then when she was revived, her spirit returned to her body, and she said, by the way, you know, there's a ceiling fan here in the hospital room. If you look on the top of the ceiling fan, which was invisible from the room because it's the top of the fan, but she saw it from her perspective near the ceiling, she thought there's a red sticker, and she described it in great detail. Well, they got a ladder, they went up, and they looked, and sure enough, on the top of one of the blades of the ceiling fan, there's the red sticker. So now that's the kind of corroboration I'm looking for, something that tells me that apart from an actual out-of-body experience, that's inexplicable. And we have the case of the young girl who drowned in Utah in a swimming pool at the YMCA, and she had no brain waves, no heartbeat, no respiration for, I think 20 minutes. They take her to the hospital. She's on a machine to keep her body alive while they decide what to do. And she says, but I was conscious the whole time. And when her parents came to visit her, she said, I followed them home. And she was able to describe what her mother cooked for dinner, what her parents were wearing, where her father was sitting, what toys her brother was playing with, things that she would have no way of knowing if her spirit had not followed that family back to their home at that time. So these are remarkable, and they tell us that the Bible is telling us the truth when it says that, when we die, our spirit separates from our body. Now, again, these are people who are going to return. These are people who are clinically dead, but they're going to be revived.
Well, and again, you've talked about, of course, deathbed visions, near-death experiences, but I thought it was really appropriate that you put in a piece with Scott McKnight on what we can know about heaven, because ultimately some people might say, okay, these people are closer to death than you and I have ever been, but what is really on the other side? And that's why I thought that chapter was so key for people that will get this book as well.
Yeah, a lot of people think that heaven is going to be a place up in the clouds somewhere when we're kind of ghostly apparitions and we're playing harps and singing worship songs all the time. When in reality, it's going to be renewal of our world without the sin that has corroded our world. And so it'll be a very physical place where we will be alive, interacting with other people and worshiping God in our now redeemed bodies, our bodies that have been transformed for a supernatural existence, as Jesus' body was the same body that he died in, and yet when he was resurrected, it had some different qualities to it. And so one of the things he points out is so many Christians, despite our well intentions, when we die, we're going to be at odds with some other people. We're going to have some arguments or something with some other Christians, and no, it's not a good thing to do, but yes, we end up doing it. And Scott McKnight believes that the first thing that's going to happen in heaven is it'll be a time of reconciliation. And so I had a terrible experience with my father. We had a very difficult relationship. He told me on the eve of my high school graduation, I don't have enough love for you to fill my little finger. But he was a Christian. I believe he's in heaven. And I believe now he is fully repentant of his attitudes and wanting to be reconciled. I'm repentant of the things that drove me to live a rebellious life that pushed all my dad's buttons and so forth. So when I get to heaven, there'll be a reconciliation. We'll both want to be reconciled, and we'll then be able to be in a father-son relationship for eternity like we wish we had in this world. So I think that's an interesting insight into what might happen. Maybe it's an instantaneous thing. Maybe it's the first hour in heaven. But there's got to be some opportunity for reconciliation because, despite our best intentions, we're often at odds with other believers.
That's right. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a couple of other issues. One, of course, is a chapter by J. Warner Wallace on the evidence for the resurrection, but of course, we've talked about that before. But I did want to focus a little bit of time on our good friend Ron Rhodes, because ghost stories, psychics, and the paranormal, a lot of people interested in the supernatural, but they're going in the wrong direction. We'll talk about that with Lee Strobel right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Lee Strobel with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Seeing the Supernatural. Let me just mention there are other chapters we haven't had a chance to get to, heaven and hell and evidence for life after death because of the resurrection. But I did want to focus some time, Lee, on this last chapter that you have before the conclusion on ghost stories, psychics, and the paranormal. As you well know, we produce these booklets, and the one I have that just came out is on what I call false spirituality, because we're running into so many people that say, I'm spiritual but not religious. Now, sometimes that means I'm just a seeker, but sometimes it means I'm going to get involved with psychic stuff or yoga or the paranormal, and that has a real draw, and that's certainly one of the reasons why you thought it was appropriate to write this book.
That's exactly right, and it is so important because, for example, I have this chapter I deal with psychics and with ghosts and things like that. Well, we're told specifically in Scripture not to get involved with mediums or psychics, and we're told that this is an abomination to the Lord. Well, when people get involved with that kind of stuff, of course they're going to get led into all kinds of demonic activity, very dangerous stuff. And in my book, I expose the various ways that psychics try to fool people into thinking that they know more than they do. And ghosts, the true definition of a ghost is a spirit of someone who has died, but that spirit refuses to enter into the afterlife. Well, I don't see an example of that in Scripture. And so I'm skeptical of these kinds of things, and I think we have to be very careful. I have a whole chapter on the demonic, and we have to be very careful. These apparitions that people encounter that they interpret as being ghosts are most often, I think, demonic in origin.
Yes,
and that's something we need to be aware of. And it's been said many times that there's two big mistakes we make involving the demonic. We either deny it exists, or we see a demon under every bush. And I think both those approaches are dangerous, but we have to recognize that there is a demonic realm. And while demons cannot become embodied in a Christian, in other words, they can't possess a Christian, they can hector us, they can bother us, they can, throw stones at us and so. And one of the ways I think that Satan seeks to confuse us is through these apparitions that we interpret as being ghosts. So I have a section from Ron Rhodes, our good friend, who talks about how we can discern that and what steps we can take to put on the full armor of God to protect ourselves from that. By the way, I was doing a national radio show a couple of weeks ago, and the topic of demons came up. And when it came up, we heard this guttural growl, like, come up. And I'm thinking, am I imagining that? So when the show was over, I called the host. I said, did you hear that? And he said, yeah. He said, wasn't me, wasn't you. What was that? And we actually have it on tape. And
wow.
So I thought it was interesting that it happened right when we began talking about the demonic. And could it be an example of demons trying to harass us? Well, I think it could be an example of that.
Ron Rhodes, who you interviewed, I've asked him before, how do you bear reading some of the books? I wouldn't even want to go into his library. And he says, well, my wife always tries to keep me accountable and said I should read 2 positive books before one of the negative ones. But nevertheless, he's made their good case that sometimes people even say, well, what about Samuel supposedly appeared to Saul? Yes. And isn't that an example of ghost? And I think he's done a very good job of clarifying that. So I do want people to know that if you're dealing right now with somebody who's kind of into the psychics, this book might get them, first of all, to understand biblical understanding and hear these incredible stories, and second of all, warning. But you end at the end by talking about what the unseen world means to you today. And one point of that is you say our soul points to the supernatural. And it does seem to me that the way this book is written and the wisdom of your editors at Zondervan make this a book that I would want to hand to a lot of individuals. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, my hope is that Christians will read the book, as many have, and say it deepened my faith. It opened my eyes to some things that I wasn't aware of, and my faith is stronger and deeper. I have more courage now because things have been put into perspective. But then my hope is they'll give the book away to a friend, like someone you mentioned, someone who's spiritually confused, maybe someone who's dabbling with Ouija boards or with psychics or whatever, and give it to them, hoping that the common interest in supernatural things might be an open door to them learning the gospel. And in the book, at the end, in the last chapter, the gospel is clearly spelled out for those that want to receive Christ. So I'm an evangelist at heart. I want to see people come to faith in Christ, and I hope this can be a vehicle for achieving that.
Well, again, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, because you certainly do address angels and demons. We didn't talk much about demons and some of the dreams and a variety of others, but in some respects, the first couple of chapters are really helpful for the non-Christian who's kind of a materialist, an atheist, a skeptic, like you were, who is saying, well, there's really no supernatural. The second of your book is really for the person that maybe is a little too overly spiritual in some respects and maybe going down the wrong path. So it's really one of those very unique books, I think, that you have written that I can give to people all over the spectrum, and they're going to benefit from some of the chapters in your book.
Well, I appreciate that. I really seek out these experts, many of whom you know personally, people who are leaders in their field with PhDs who understand this stuff and yet are strong believers whose beliefs are grounded in Scripture. And I asked them the tough questions I had when I was a skeptic and the questions that commonly are asked about these topics. And I kind of force them to put the cookies on the bottom shelf. In other words, to explain this stuff in a way, if I can understand it, anybody can understand it. So that's my goal.
Let me just mention before I let you go that we do have a link to leestrobel.com. So that's the place where you can find out about this book or any other and books and speaking. Let me also encourage people to schedule you to come and speak. I've had the privilege many times of sitting in the audience when you have wowed people with some of the stories you've told and certainly educated us. So there is an opportunity for people to connect up with you. There's a contact button as well. And again, trying to even list all the books that you have would take a little too long. But again, it is such a great opportunity always to spend time with you. And so thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Well, I appreciate you, Kerby, and all that your ministry does. You are so important to the kingdom and making a huge difference in so many lives.
Again, let me just, before we go, mention that we do have some of those links. We have the link to leestrobel.com. And some of the most recent books, of course, this one we talk about Seeing the Supernatural, The Case for Heaven. One that we certainly have recommended time and time again is God Real. It is amazing. Every second of the day, hundreds of individuals type into some kind of search engine, does God exist? Is God real? And this was an attempt to really answer some of those questions. Of course, we've talked about some of his other books like Do Miracles Exist? So you are going to find lots of great resources there on the website of Lee Strobel. But of course, you can also find them on our website, which is pointofview.net. He was gracious enough to mention that if you haven't signed up to receive my Viewpoints commentary, well, that's available there, and it is certainly there. We, of course, have videos. We have Take Action. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to listen to this again, I'd like to pass it on to someone else, you can go to our website right now and you can click on that button that says Watch or Listen, and that can then be a link that you could send to someone who would benefit from listening to this. I am quite sure that Megan is going to put the Point of View highlights on Spotify from some of this. So again, that's another place where you can find that. And we really want to put it in your hands so that you can have a dynamic ministry. But one last time, the book is entitled Seeing the Supernatural, Investigating Angels, Demons, Mystical Dreams, Near-Death Encounters, and Other Mysteries of the Unseen World, published by Zondervan, written by Lee Strobel. And you've been listening to Point of View.
Let's be honest. Getting a well-rounded and biblical understanding of current events takes time that many of us simply don't have. Well, here's the good news. You can get thoroughly researched biblical insight on a variety of topics in 2 minutes or less each day by subscribing to Kerby Anderson's Viewpoints commentary. These short, free emails offer Kerby's personal perspective on issues affecting us in America, and they are filled with educational resources. Listen to this testimonial from David, a longtime Viewpoint subscriber.
I've been reading Kerby's daily commentaries every weekday for years now. Never miss one because they're always incredibly well written and researched, to the point, and really are meaningful. I would recommend the commentaries to anybody.
Subscribe to Viewpoints for free by going to pointofview.net/signup. That's pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.